Good afternoon all. Today's webinar will be on GP property and partnership change. So I'll be running through the slides. The webinar's an hour long, so some bits will move fairly quickly over, so sort of partnership agreements and that sort of thing. So just bear that in mind. And if you've got further queries about those or questions, let Tom know in the chat box, and then we can answer the best of our ability. But some of the questions might be for your solicitor, just to make you aware now. So, just so you're aware, GP surveyors are a specialist primary care premises surveyors based in Sheffield and cover the whole of the UK. We've been providing specialist services for roughly 23 years now, and those services include notional rent challenges, market valuations, sale and leasebacks, rent reviews of leases, as well as pharmacy leases, and further down that as well, we've looked at sort of pharmacy implants and pharmacy renewals and things like that. Roughly, we carry out about 300 notional rent reviews every year, up and down the country. So our evidence is quite large. So the knowledge basis of which we're pulling together at the moment is spanned across 23 years, and yeah, some of our surveyors are ex-district valuers as well, so we have got quite a wide knowledge basis to provide this information for you. So what we'll cover today is managing partnership change and the aspects that you have to look at to be able to do partnership change effectively, and succession planning and the property, so what you're looking for in the future and moving forward. So we'll start with managing partnership change. The partnership change, usually we start with your partnership agreement and what that states. So it's essential that you have an up-to-date partnership agreement that is robust enough to clarify all the different scenarios that are going on within GP property at the moment. For example, locums, salaried GPs, as well as partners within the practice, but not partners of the property. So your partnership agreement has to be quite robust and have quite a lot of detail within it for managing these aspects of moving forward within GP property. If you don't have a partnership agreement, what happens is you revert back to something that's called partnership at will, and that's backdated, and it's from the Partnership Act, which is in 1890, so it's really outdated. It doesn't deal with any of the modern day issues, for example, partners of the business but not partners of the property, and it causes quite a lot of conflict. So one of the issues that we find in regards to a partnership at will is that automatically everybody has equal shares in everything. So the last thing you want as a partner who's bought into a practice is for a partner who hasn't bought into practice to be getting an equal share of something that you're paying for and they haven't. So what we want to make sure is that your partnership agreement deals with all these aspects. So if you do have a change in partnership, that you know exactly, you can pull out your partnership agreement and it'll state what you have to do and how long you have to do it. So a partnership agreement should stipulate how the property is to be valued and decreases the chance of a partnership dispute. So it will tell you how you should value the property, whether that be as a medical property, as a healthcare centre, or as a third issue. So for example, it's meant to be valued as a house because that's what it originally was, and it's been converted into a GP premises. So it'll state all these things in your partnership agreement, or it should. It'll state things like, should there be a single joint expert appointed to do the valuation, which means that if you appoint one expert between the incoming party and the outgoing party of evaluation, for example, then you remove the chance of dispute later on because you've agreed that this third party, this joint expert, will give you a valuation that you will both agree upon. Exiting an incoming partner, appoint own valuers and negotiate price. So again, this is all stated within the partnership agreement. I would suggest, usually it's practice managers that hold on to these things, but you whip that out and you just make sure it does state all these things within it. If you have an exiting and incoming GP partners, if you should have your own valuers deal with that. Reason for it being is that there's no conflict of interest for either party. But you can also, if there is a dispute between those valuations, which there sometimes can be, because if you do not have a partnership agreement telling you how that valuer should value the premises, they will value it differently. One may value it as a GP property, one may value it as a house, for example. Those will bring out two very different valuation figures. And that's where you'll need a third party expert to agree which valuation figure is correct. And again, your partnership agreement should state what those stages look like for you. GP practices are often valued. So as a company, we completed just over 100 market valuations last year for different purposes, but the majority of those were dealing with partnership change in one format or another. And that again is set to rise this year in 2023, and that's due to a number of factors, usually an ageing population of GPs wanting to get their buyout to retire. Further along in the presentation, we'll show you what the audience of GPs looks like at the moment. So you'll see that market valuations are becoming more increased in terms of what GPs are looking for. We've been involved in partnership disputes as well, where the partnership agreement is silent on how it should be valued, your premises. So there can be massive differences. The most recent one we've been involved with is that, like I just said, we've valued the property as an ongoing GP property. Another value has valued it as a house, and there's a 400% difference in valuation figure, and that's massive. And the whole reason for that is that as surveyors, we've assumed different things. We've assumed that the GP practice will be an ongoing GP practice, and another surveyor has assumed that it's a house. It's going to be a house after its end of use. So they're both very different valuations, but they're based on assumptions due to the fact the partnership agreement is silent on how the property should be valued. And at this point, you look at a third party to then decide which valuation is right and what figure it should be in the end. Third party, though, or partnership disputes, which is where you get your third party expert in, are very costly in terms of time and in case and funds as well. So the cheaper route is to modernise your partnership agreement to combat all these scenarios, and a well-placed solicitor would be able to do that for you with some help from a surveyor to say what those property aspects should look like. But a valuation dispute usually runs in sort of tens of thousands of pounds for both parties, for an exiting GP and for the practice itself. Because you have things like expert representation, arbitrage costs, time for all these people as well as yourselves, the costs for surveyors to do your valuations for you. So there's quite a lot to go on with valuation disputes, and they can take, rather than a valuation taking few weeks and you agree on that valuation, these disputes can take months, if not years, to solve. And again, they run into tens of thousands of pounds, so it's quite a costly nature for something that's quite not expensive to sort at the start, but it is compared to what kind of scenario you can create in the future. So in summary, your partnership agreement, just take the time to get it out and have a little look what it states in terms of the property management side of things. And it should have things like independent valuers in there, how the property should be valued, so and what purpose it should be valued for. And if you have third party arbiter, if you're going to third party to agree your valuation figure, then it should state how those stages look as well, so that you know that you don't go straight to arbitration. You have other steps before that point. And it is just to reduce the risk of these disputes further down the line, and also to have a full partnership agreement. It's quite attractive now to new incoming GP partners, so that they know exactly what they're signing in for, and they know exactly how, if they're going to buy into the property, how it will be valued when they come to exit the property. As said, get a specialist healthcare solicitor involved. They'll be able to pull out your partnership agreement and state what needs adding into it, or if it needs to be started again. And if they have any queries about property, then you need a valuation surveyor to help on that, preferably a healthcare surveyor, because the NHS obviously has quite a lot of differences to commercial or housing developments. So, Tom, has there been any questions? Because I know I run through that quite quickly.
Well, you must have done a very thorough job of that section, Bex, because we don't have any questions. So we can go on to the next part.
Perfect. Right. Oh, I've got a hand raised.
Put that hand up. Okay, we'll try and allow the microphone to Stephen. Would you like to ask a question, Stephen?
Oh, I've got them all on mute, Tom. So, do you want to pop your questions in the chat box? Because I think that might.
I thought I could enable the microphones. It looks like it's defaulted by kind of master default. So questions will have to be in the chat. Okay, well, if we carry on to the next section, if anyone does have a question, apologies for that. Could you put it down in the chat, please?
Oh, there we go.
So this is a question from Kelly. Can I clarify if the premises is going to be used for healthcare after the sale, it should be valued as a healthcare building? If it should be valued as a healthcare building?
Yes, it should. So if you're selling a property to be ongoing as a GP premises, it should still be carried out and valued as a GP premises. However, it depends on the format of sale. If you're selling, for example, to another GP partner who's incoming, then it will state in partnership agreement how it should be valued. If you're selling, for example, to the open market and you're going to lease it back, then again, it should be healthcare. But if you're selling it as an empty property, even though healthcare is more than likely going to take an interest and probably buy the property, then that is just something that you would have to discuss with the market. Usually, yes, it would be valued as a healthcare premises, but it is still linked to your rental reimbursement as well. So I think if you want some more details on that, probably give me a bell and I'll let you know how your sale would commence. But yes, usually I would say 9 times out of 10, healthcare always.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions now.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry if I'll quickly, because it's not very take too long to type a question. So we're actually in the process of getting our partnership agreement. We've had a change of partners in the last few years, and I'm planning on retiring in the next 1 to 2 years. So the only real section that's particularly of interest to me is about the premises.
Yeah.
And we have it's not a GP specialist lawyer we've got, so we have drafted it up, but we have had trouble chasing up the lawyer to finalise it. Are you able, if we, as a service, if we sent you the section that we've drafted on properties, can you give advice on that to see if it's worded correctly, covering?
We can definitely read through it and make sure that it tells us how we would value the property. That's not a problem. But to make sure that you are legally covered, you need the advice of your solicitor. But we can definitely tell you as a consultancy basis to say, yes, that tells us exactly how we're going to value it as a healthcare premises, and this is what it's saying for us to do. That's not a problem. We can do that. Yeah,
we could do that. Okay, I'll maybe catch up with you later. Okay, thanks.
Okay, just a couple more questions on this section. So would you recommend two valuations, one for an existing partner and one for a new partner buying in?
Yes, if you can't agree to one independent expert. I think the thing is usually you have your own separate valuations, because then there's not a conflict of interest. Equally, their bank, whoever may be lending towards the incoming partner, may ask for a bank valuation to be done by one of their surveyors. So usually what happens is there's two valuations completed anyway. But yeah, if you can agree to one and share the cost, that's great, but usually there are always two.
Okay, a question here from Catherine. There are different valuations depending on the length that we expect the building to be used as a healthcare building. What is the standard assumption? Is it that it would remain a healthcare building for 10 years, 20 years, question mark?
So it's very much dependent if you've got a lease in place on the property, but usually what is stated is it's the lifespan of the property. Okay, so there's not a lease in it, so it's the lifespan of the property. The NHS would probably say 15 to 20 years, so either one of those is fine. The valuation wouldn't change because the valuation is dependent on that time frame. So usually a valuation report that's given to you is based on a specific date of what it's worth on that date, rather than in 15 or 20 years time. So that should have no occurrence onto it at all. It's just to say that it is going to remain healthcare property, and that's how we're valuing it at the minute. You would only put into place another assumption would be that if the property was to be empty and there was no GP contract on the property, it would be valued as a, for example, house or commercial property for rentable rooms and things like that. 15 or 20 years doesn't really come into it.
Okay, one final question on this section. Can I ask, please, if a second valuation is done more than 6 to 12 months after the first one, is it reasonable to ask to backdate it to the first valuation? So I think to simplify that question would be, can we do a valuation that's back in time?
You can do a valuation back in time, but you would need up-to-date records of that time frame. For example, rent on that at that time, what was going on within the property, and all that sort of stuff. So you would need a very good record of what happened. You can backdate them. You can't forward date them. So that date has to be either in the present in terms of now or before. So, but you can't go into the future.
Okay, yeah, the rest are just some comments between the attendees. So I think, yeah, we can go on to the next section.
Okay, so we'll move forward. Succession planning and property. So I think we can all agree that the landscape in terms of retiring partners and incoming GPs has really changed significantly over the last few years. Now what that looks like is you tend to have GPs retiring who own the property, but not many GP partners are willing to buy into the property. As you can see by this, so retiring partners are retaining their share in the property because they can't have well, they don't have options of people buying in to take their shares over. And that's due to the incoming GPs being reluctant to buy in, and that's through numerous things. When I've chatted to GPs who are looking to go into partnerships, it's usually due to the fact, you know, they have student loans, they have mortgages, they're just starting families. You know, I always joke that if my husband came home and said, I've just taken out another mortgage for the property I'm working in and it's £500,000, I think I'd have an aneurysm. But with the knowledge bases I have in this area is that it's very secure. I still recommend for incoming GPs to buy into property and go from there. Because it's still a very profitable business to have and a profitable model of ownership to be in. Obviously, we had a recruitment crisis with the shortage of GPs, so again, that affected retiring partners not being able to get their buyouts. And the age and gender profile currently of the current workforce of GPs is changing. Yeah, so and many GPs are looking to be locums or salaried because they have more benefits for that, you know, pick their own time frames. They come in, they work, they leave. Not many are taking up the partnership roles, as it were. So, aging workforce, more doctors coming up to retirement, more doctors retiring earlier than before 60 as well. So these are all coming up more frequently every time we see this. Incoming GPs are reluctant and unable to bind the property, which again forces retiring partners to still retain getting a rent from the property but not get their share out. Oh, sorry, I'm just getting lots of messages through. Property, and so in terms of the property, so your partnership agreement would usually say that an exiting GP has either 12 to 18 months to be bought out of the property. If that hasn't happened, then you should put a lease in place to combat some of the problems you would have with a retiring partner who doesn't have any interest in the business but does want to receive his rent because he still owns the property. So if we go further, a quarter of partners are over 55. So that's across the UK. So a quarter of all partners in the GP workforce are over 55, and majority of those are planning to retire earlier than 60. So they're looking to retire now. 60% of those who claimed their NHS pension for the first time in 2020 to 2021 retired earlier than 65. So retired earlier, wanted to get their pension, left. But that leaves quite a big hole in terms of property ownership for new GPs coming through wanting to buy into the property. We've already said that that's less desirable for the new GPs that are coming up through the ages who want to be part of partnership, but they don't want to be part of the property. And also, we obviously have the GP recruitment crisis, so there are less GPs wanting to buy in and less GPs in overall anyway. So just a bit of a poll, I think, Tom, for you to launch. So I can tell you exactly what we'll talk about in a bit.
I'll quickly just put these polls up and then we'll backtrack and answer any of the questions that have come through. Just bear with me a second. Okay, so this is just to kind of get a bit of a gauge of where everyone's at in kind of the process of their partnership change, really. Just to see what's more pertinent to talk about. Okay, I think the majority of people have answered it now. So I guess, as we expect, the majority of people have signed up for this webinar today. Most people, it's kind of more short term than long term, this year or next year.
Yeah.
Now, if we can just get a bit of an idea of the current ownership status of your properties, and whether it's owned by the current GP partners, third party with or without a lease, or it's the retired GP partners own it, or you're not quite sure. Okay, so that's the vast majority of people. It's owned by the current GP partners. Right, there we go. So if I just quickly jump back into the chat before we start the next section on lease, and thanks for answering those, that'll kind of help Bex just bear that in mind while we're doing the next section. And then I'll just roll back up to, I think it was Bippin had a question. Okay, so Bippin's asked, usually a bank requires a valuation. So would that be in addition to the buyer and seller having independent valuations?
Not necessarily, no. You could have just the bank valuation. They usually come out, again, very dependent. Bank valuations don't tend to have a specialist surveyor in the healthcare industry. So they normally have a board of surveyors that you can pick from. But if your partnership agreement isn't up to date, then they will value it based on a commercial aspect, which will be a very different valuation to, for example, right? So, and then you would have to agree a middle frame for buy-ins and buyout prices. Usually what happens is the incoming partner will have a bank valuation done. The exiting partner will have a valuation done by somebody like ourselves. And as long as your partnership agreement is robust and states how it should be valued, those valuations should come reasonably close together. If it doesn't, then that's where you'll find that they're further apart. But yeah, you can have it both ways. You can have just a bank valuation by the incoming partner and a valuation by the exiting partner, or that partner who's looking to buy in, rather than get the banks involved straight away, they might have a valuation done by a healthcare specialist. But that is their sole cost. So the incoming GP partner should pay for whatever valuation they would like, whether that be a bank or us. We would normally recommend that they have a healthcare specialist valuation as well as their bank valuation.
I've just seen a couple of messages pop up. If anyone has to leave at any point, obviously that's fine. It is all recorded, and I'll send out a recording to everyone when the session's finished, so you can pick up where we've left off. I'll just jump back in a couple more questions. If one party is not happy with a figure of a joint valuation, what are their next options?
Separate valuations. So the person who isn't happy with their valuation can have another valuation completed, and then you can go to third party. But usually what you find is that they're not happy because it's too high a price, and that's the problem. But equally, another valuation will be based on the partnership agreement usually, and it'll come out at a very similar figure normally, depending on the evidence. But yeah, if you've agreed to have a joint expert do your valuation, normally that's the figure, unless that other person, the one who's disputing it, goes out and gets a secondary valuation, and then you'd again have a negotiation process.
Okay, I've got a couple more questions. This is one from Robert Price. I plan to retire in January 2024, leaving one doctor as last man standing. If he decides to close the property and decides to close the practice and sell it on the open market in 6 months, for example, at a much higher valuation, do I have any protection?
It's very unlikely that, unless you're in the height of London, that if he was selling an empty property, he would get a higher valuation anyway, because usually properties do better in terms of their valuation and for sale if they have an ongoing business within them, as well as healthcare does very well because they have backed by the NHS, and that's where their rental reimbursements coming from. You don't, unfortunately. If you sell your share to that partner and they become sole owner, they can do what they like with the property, and you're paid out what you're paid out. It would be very much like if you bought a house and you sold it on in 6 months' time and got more money for it. You wouldn't expect the previous owners to come for you for more money. But like I say, if he became last man standing and he had to empty the property, it's very unlikely that his valuation figure would be higher or that he would be able to sell.
Okay, couple more questions. If your partnership agreement states that the outgoing partner must be bought out by the partnership within 6 months, how is that enforceable?
You can go to court for it, so it is a solicitor way of enforcing it. However, if there's no money there to be had and there's nobody to be able to buy him out, then you can't buy him out. You would struggle. You would either have to get the bank mortgage on the property, if that would be possible. He could look to put a charge on the property. Usually, though, what happens is you put a lease in place and he has the right to receive his current rent that he's getting until you can sell. That's what usually happens. It's very unlikely for a charge to be put on the property or for another mortgage to be taken out, but those are realistic circumstances. So yeah, it's not enforceable in terms of he can't go and get somebody to come and knock on the door and remove all goods. But he can go to a solicitor and see what his options are. Usually, though, we would advise you put a lease in place or you look to do a sale and lease back, which he can ask to have happen.
Okay, a couple more questions. I'll try and whiz through so we can finish the rest of the sections. My current situation is that I own 99.98% of the building, and others own only the remainder. As the bank insisted that only one partner could not own the building, do we need a lease to clarify the situation as well?
No, as long as all partners are within inside the property and nobody's retired, you don't need a lease. But what you will need to do is state that within your partnership agreement.
Okay. Our bank valuation is usually lower than a specialist valuation, even if based on the same criteria, as they are in fact acting for lenders.
Yes.
I think we covered that off previously, didn't we?
Yes, they are.
Regarding fees, we can email people separately. That would answer Ian's question. So Andrew's asked, when we have had a specialist valuation for the outgoing partner, which has been very different from the bank valuation for the incoming partner, which has been much lower, how does the incoming partner raise the funds if the bank will only lend on their valuation?
It is a cash aspect of it, unfortunately. So yeah, it's very dependent. I always recommend Lloyds as a great bank lender because their valuations tend to come out very similar. I also recommend Ian Crompton, who's a great bank facilitator, to look at bank valuations in terms of where they can get the lending from and things like that. It unfortunately is part and parcel. It's a bit like, again, like if you were buying a house, you put your offer on the table. If your bank's not happy with it and you can't raise the additional funds, that's the problem. Usually there's negotiation. So usually the exiting GP realises that an incoming GP, they're very few and far between. So he will either reduce how much he's willing to accept on his share of the property, or will look to put a lease in place for the property. And you could still have another partner and they could buy in, but those are the options really. So yeah, so you would look to either put a lease in place or you would look to negotiate on the price.
Okay, I think, yeah, if we carry on with the next section, and anything we've not answered in this, we pick back up, just conscious of time. And
Yeah.
kind of want to get you guys all the information that we've got for you.
Okay, so we'll move on forward to succession planning. So we're going to cover leases, back, sale and transfer and sale. Again, all these options are very change for the environment, the situation that you're in. It's not a one size fits all option or solution. So yeah, they are interchangeable. So leases. There's another poll. But I think because, Tom, we didn't have a lot of leased properties, I'll just move on forward.
That's not relevant for these guys.
Yeah, so we'll go through it, but so a lease is required when there's an uncommon party. So, for example, an exiting GP property owner who's retiring, and you can't afford to buy them out, that would require a lease because he still needs the right to be able to retain rent. When the intention of occupation is for a term of in excess of 3 years. So what that means is that if you plan to be within the property for longer than 3 years and you have an uncommon party, then you again need a lease. You can no longer have a license, which is another option, but you would need a lease. And leases in excess of 7 years should be registered and attract stamp duty land tax. So there's some information there. So leases that are normally advisable for the NHS are 15 years, so they should always attract stamp duty land tax, and they should always be registered with land registry. The intention in terms of occupation, whether you're going to be there for 3 years, the only time this comes into question is if the GP business is moving premises. And we've talked through uncommon parties. So leases. A lease is a formal document to regulate the occupation of the building. There's 4 main requirements of a lease, or there's 4 main requirements for a lease to be a lease, I guess is the best way to put it. The price, which is the rent that you'll be receiving, the parties that are named, so the landlord and the tenant, the period, the duration of time. Now that usually is about 15 or 20 years, and the property, the address of the property, and the boundary of the property as well. Those 4 things are what makes a lease a lease. Now, a lease is a very hefty document. If it doesn't have one of these 4 items, then it's no longer a lease. So, what are key considerations if you are seeking or being asked to enter into a lease? Do you want to stay in the building? Is one. How long and what are your future plans? So again, sort of succession planning for the business side of things. Are you planning to be a GP premises for the next 15 years? Are you planning to remain in the property for the duration of that time? Are all things you need to discuss. Who's planning to stay within the property? Who's retiring? Can you recruit? Again, all things that you need to discuss. Is the building fit for purpose or does it need investment? So is the building working? Is it functional? Is it CQC approved? Or do you need something like a new boiler? Is the wallpaper falling down? All those sorts of things. Those are things that you need to consider before you enter into a lease. The other would be, is the building part of the NHS future strategy? So the way you can test this is when you send your lease for approval from the NHS, if they don't approve it because of the length of term of lease, you know that they're not planning for you to be within the estate strategy for the duration of that lease, which means they're probably planning for you to merge or move or, I don't know, hand back the GMS contract. It's very unlikely, but those things are potentials. So yeah, you want to make sure you chat to the ICB to see what are their plans for you as a property? Is the building site sufficient for future needs of the practice and patients? And what we mean by that is, do you have a housing development going on down the road? It's going to provide you with potential of 20,000 patients. Can your property actually handle 20,000 patients? Is there room to expand? Is there not? The other things to consider is, who will your landlord be? So is it going to be the retiring GP property owners, or are they going to sell? And are you going to have somebody else as a landlord, for example, Assura or PHP? So an example would be this. And another thing to really is the responsibilities of repair and improvement and insurance on the property. So there's another thing you have to take into consideration. An example, a property with a GP practice tenant and a retired GP landlord without a lease is falling short in its statutory and minimum standards. So it's no longer viable for CQC, it's falling, it's not really safe for patients anymore. Who's responsible for the costs? Is it the landlord, who's a retired GP property owner who receives the rent, or is it the GP practice who are within the property, who are running daily clinics and things like that? Who's responsible for those improvement costs when there's no lease in place? The answer is it could be either. It's really it's not clear, because although a landlord's receiving rent, that doesn't automatically say that he has to repair the building. So it's really needed a lease that states all these things within it. Either party can be responsible for the improvement works, but the works would need consent from both parties to be completed, and you wouldn't obtain any NHS funding or grants if the lease is not in place. So that's another thing to bear in mind. If you're wanting grants and funding and you don't have a lease in place, but you should have a lease in place, you won't be eligible for them. Leases. Why should I have a lease? It's a legal requirement. Is to protect you as tenants and to protect the landlord in terms of what your rights and responsibilities are. It clarifies the rights and obligations of both parties for the lease. So, for example, again, if you do have works that need to be done for the property, it will explain who those works and who is responsible for those works. Defines the use of the property, so whether it should be used as healthcare or whether part of it's used for office space, therefore, and then helps avoid costly disputes again. Tom's looking at me like there's some questions. Should I slow down? Sorry. You're on mute, so I definitely can't hear you.
I was just reading the questions to prepare for when we get to the next section. So sorry to distract you, Rebecca.
No, you're right. Benefits of having a lease: it's a security investment for the landlord. So that means that if you ever did want to sell the property, a lease in place would allow that to happen. And it protects the value of that. So if you've had a valuation done, 9 times out of 10, it's based on a hypothetical lease being in place. But if you have a proper lease put in place, when there's an uncommon party, it will protect the value of that. Leases are transferable, so if you do want to sell the property, it can be transferred to the new owner. And it provides clarity of rights and responsibilities and insuring costs. And again, helps avoid costly property disputes, which means that, for example, if you can't clarify who the repairs are for, you would go to a court who would then either enforce a lease onto you, or they would tell you who the repair costs go to, but you would have it's very costly to go down that road. Benefits of having a lease with a tenant would be you have the right to use the property for the term of the lease. So you wouldn't be classed as, for example, a squatter or anything like that. You have the right to renew the lease at the end of it. So if you have the full 15 years and you go, actually want to stay, you could have another full 15 years because you have the right to that. You have the right to receive NHS rental reimbursement for the duration of the lease. So this is a huge one. If you have an uncommon party, for example, a GP has retired and they still own the property and you don't have a lease in place, technically you don't have the right to receive rental reimbursement. It's very unlikely that that they would stop your rental reimbursement, but it is something to be aware of, that you only have the right to be within that building to provide healthcare clinics if you have a lease in place. A GP contractor requires a secured property to operate the NHS contract. Just said that, and NHS guidance. So, you know, if a lease is in place, the NHS are happy to help with things. They're more amenable, shall we say, to chatting amongst the lease and whose repairs are what. But if there isn't a lease in place, they're less amenable to that because you don't actually have the right to be within that building. Facilities for future planning. For example, if you want grants and improvement grants or any funding or anything, a lease will facilitate that. If you don't have any lease in place, the NHS won't grant you any improvement grants now, because you don't have the right to the building, you don't have any say in the building, and yeah, so the NHS legally need you to have a lease put in place and for it to be signed for you to apply for NHS improvement grants. And again, helps avoid costly disputes. Question time.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions here covering a broad range of some of the things we've talked about already. So the first question is, who usually pays the stamp duty land tax?
The tenant.
Okay,
That's who. Yeah, that was very quick. Yes, no, it's a tenant cost. Sometimes the NHS can help with it, but it is a tenant's responsibility.
Okay, Kelly has asked, do things like work required, i.e. a new boiler, affect evaluation?
No. So your valuation isn't based on sort of things like that. It is partly based on the condition of the building. But for example, if you need a boiler repair, then that is technically under it's different. It wouldn't affect your valuation because it's based on rent, patients, state of the building, but also environment, a lot of other things. But a boiler repair would potentially affect your sale. So it would be something that somebody would come around potentially and look, if they were buying the property, notice that the boiler probably needs a boiler repair and say that that is either coming out of the sale price or it's a cost to you guys to do. I personally also would say if there's any works like that, I would get them done before you enter into a lease, because once you've entered into a lease, then those repairs could take forever to do. Equally, it could be your responsibility to do those repairs anyway. So yeah, I would always get anything like that done before you enter into a lease.
Okay. Jenny has said, as an outgoing partner who's waiting to sell my share, if I was to arrange a lease, does that impact on the notional rent income being pensionable?
I wouldn't know in terms of the notional rent being pensionable. That's more of an accountancy question. It doesn't affect the notional rent in terms of the amount, but in terms of it being pensionable, I wouldn't be able to advise on that.
Okay. Here's one from Philip. So he said earlier we mentioned leases for lengthy valuations and disputes. But my understanding is that entrepreneurial relief expires 1 year after a partner's retirement. when there is this, where there is this dispute going on, is there any prospect of latitude to the entrepreneurial relief situation with HMC? So that's an accountancy.
Yeah, and I think it's longer than a
Again,
year, just so you are aware for entrepreneurial relief. Just double check, but I think it's longer than a year. I think it's 3, but that
Yeah,
could be changing because, well, only through the grapevine, changing governments can change these things. So, but yeah, I think it's 3 years.
Oh, okay. So yeah, see, obviously an accountant to get clarification on that
Yeah.
one. Bipin has said, I'm a new partner and I want to buy in, but interest rates are very high at the moment and notional rents are significantly lower than the payments. Would this be reflected in the valuation? Would it be advisable to defer buying and set up a lease?
Ooh. Okay, so interest rates, not something you have control over. Valuations have changed slightly in the last 6 months and have become more flattened, I would say, in terms of the market as well for selling, because obviously buying, you need the bank. So those have become a little bit more steady. Notional rent doesn't change. That is a negotiation process. It's to do with it's nothing to do with banks. It's to do with the property. So in terms of would it be better for you to set up a lease now? I mean, you could. Obviously, if you enter into a lease, it's for the term of that lease, and it can only be dissolved if both parties seem it deemable to dissolve the lease. So if you are wanting to buy in, I would try and hold off or change the bank you're looking at speaking to for the rates, because once you've entered into the lease, it's technically binding unless you both give it up and dissolve, but a solicitor would advise you better on that. And again, maybe give us an email and I can give you Ian's details, Ian Crompton, and he could advise you on the banks a little bit more.
Okay, another lease question. Is a lease needed if half the premises are owned by an ex-GP partner?
Do you mean they own 50% of
Well,
the
that's what I'm a little
premises?
bit confused at. Whether that means the percentage of the surgery or physically half of it.
Yeah, I've not heard of a GP owning half of the physical building. I've heard them owning 50%. So yeah, it's needed if they've retired and there's not a person within the property. You do need a lease. They can't be uncommon parties. So yeah, I would say yes, but maybe email us.
Okay, a couple more questions. How long does a valuation last?
Valuations last, well, here's the question, isn't it? Valuations are valuations of the day, really, of the date you want, but 3 months we normally say. Unless something has happened and the banks crash or something like that. But yeah, roughly 3 months they last.
Okay, another lease question here from Amar. Is the NHS likely to approve a lease that's 10 years or longer?
Usually the NHS approve 15-year leases. 10 years would change your rent, so they're unlikely to approve that, but they potentially could. And they've stopped approving 20-year leases unless it's on a brand spanking new building.
Okay, there's a couple more questions, but again, I'm conscious of time, so these might be covered in the next section.
Massively so, right.
Repeat.
I'll move on. So sale and lease back. I'm going to go pretty brief on these, just because I'm conscious of time. But if you're interested in any of these, obviously give us a bell and we can discuss it further. Sale and lease back is the sale of property to an investor or a third party, and the signing of a lease to allow you to continue use for the building for a fixed term. So you would create a lease. The GP tenants would sign it, so whoever's in the building would sign that lease, and you would sell the property to a third party, for example, Assura, PHP, or another doctor. Why might practice considers selling the building and leasing it back from purchaser. Recruitment and succession issues, not being able to buy out a GP who's retiring, no longer wanting the responsibility of the property in terms of insuring it or paying for it, last man standing issues, and avoid the hassle of redeveloping the site at the end of its useful life. So you don't want to own a building when it's no longer deemed a healthcare property and having to redevelop it. What issues may you need to solve to complete a sale and leaseback? Who's going to sign the lease? That's a massive one. NHS approval for it. So have you sent it to the IFCB? Have they approved the rent? Have they approved the lease terms for you? Finding a purchase at an agreeable price. That's another one. So have you put it to the market at the right price for the value of the property? Are the GPs who are selling property happy with that price? And agreeing the lease terms that are acceptable to all parties, and all parties would be the purchaser, the seller, the tenant, the NHS, the district valuer. So yes, all those parties need to be happy with the lease terms. So in summary, it facilitates the release of equity and removes a buy-in. So if you sell the property in sale and leaseback, your incoming GP partners no longer have to worry about buy-ins. The big importance is the lease terms. So you want to make sure your lease terms are correct and that they're viable. So yeah, you definitely want a specialist solicitor and a specialist surveyor to help you create that lease. So you are covered from all angles. It's not a solution for everybody. For example, if you have an Aviva mortgage, I don't know if people remember Aviva mortgages, they used to offer quite good rates, and then what they used to get you in the end for was paying back too early. So if you had an Aviva mortgage, we used to say don't sell the property, because you would sell the property, you may only have, let's say, 20,000 left on the mortgage, but an Aviva mortgage redemption penalty for paying back early used to be £100,000, for example. So you would just lose too much money from doing it. It can be a solution when the future of the site is uncertain and the value is limited. So if you're unsure as to whether you are part of the NHS strategy, or you're not sure how the NHS strategy looks in your local area for the time being, it definitely secures your site for the remainder of the lease, because the NHS have to approve it, and they're approving that you will be in that site for the remainder of that lease. So yeah, definitely worth it for sort of future-proofing the site for you. Sale and transfer. So sale and transfer is different to a sale and leaseback in that you transfer the GP contract across to the buyer. So this is only viable for people who are in a last man standing situation, really, who don't have any partners, or all the partners are looking to retire. But you don't want to hand back the GP contract because you would likely lose the value of your property. So what we look to do is we look to find a buyer who already holds GMS contracts, for example, another GP or a trust, and they will buy the property and take over the running of the property as well. Benefits: releasing capital and short transaction time. So a sale and leaseback can take between 12 to 18 months, roughly, because of the having to have the NHS approval on the lease. This sale and transfer takes about 3 to 4 months from start to finish. So it's a much quicker transaction time, and you will release capital a lot quicker. Okay, so we're at the end. I know I've rushed through those last few slides. apologies, I think we've had so many questions as well, but if you are wanting more advice on any of that, please ring in and you'll speak to myself or my colleague Kelly on those 2 items anyway, so we can definitely help with any general queries. But are there any general questions now for me?
Yeah, there's 4 or 5 more questions, and obviously we'll just stay on and answer these, and if anyone's got any more, we're happy to just stay on and chat to you guys. Right, let's pick up where we've left off here. Okay, I'll start from the bottom up. Is it worth getting a market valuation for current owners, even if a sale is not intended immediately?
It's always worth knowing what you value it, what your property is valued at. It depends. I mean, they're not cheap valuations, I guess. But if you are looking to sell in the near future, it gives you a good benchmark as to whether you would clear the mortgage, whether you would be all walking away with some money at the end of it. So it's a good benchmark, I guess, to do it. I have a client who gets a market valuation done every year. I'm not saying it's ever needed, but he has one done every year just to know where he sits in terms of the market, but also if it's the right time to sell and how much money he'd walk away with if he did it at that point. He also then can give an incoming GP a rough estimate of what they'd be looking to buy in for, and that's why he does it. So yeah, I think if you're looking to sell, it's always worth knowing before you take those steps if you'd walk away with some money, if you'd clear your mortgages and any debt.
Okay. This is from Jenny regarding sale and leaseback.
Yeah.
If you were to proceed with a sale and leaseback, to buy out an outgoing partner, hang on, sorry. Oh, okay. So this is basically that a practice agreement stipulates how the practice is to be valued.
Yeah.
As an MV, but it doesn't stipulate anything about sale and leaseback. So if a partner is leaving and they're having to have a sale and leaseback in order to actually pay the departing partners, how does the valuation of that person that's departing get triggered? Would they have to pay them that proportion of the MV valuation, or what the property sold for?
Sold for. Yeah, so unless you buy them out before the sale, you would give them the share of the sale price.
Even if that's not stipulated in the practice agreement?
Yes. I mean, if you're not wanting to do that, then yes, you'd have to buy them out before because they still own the property. So the owners trigger the sale and lease back. So the owners all have to agree and all have to sign an agent's contract. So the agent's working on behalf of the owners for a sale and lease back. So yes, unless you buy them out before, they are entitled to the share of the sale.
Oh, okay. How do break clauses work? That's quite an open-ended question.
Yeah, so there's a lot of break clauses. They work differently. So you could have a break clause that can be initiated by yourself as a tenant, or you could have a break clause that's initiated by the landlord. They're very wide in terms of why they can be triggered and who can trigger them and at what point you can trigger them. But they do affect your value of the property. Because you're only giving the owner a risk-free period of a certain amount of time for you to be in that property. So the valuation does change for a lease with a break clause in.
Okay, this is from just concerning leases from Amar. What are the risks to the partner signing a long lease? What happens when they retire?
Then the risk or the responsibility is for you to get another partner to sign in as you sign off the lease. So you would need to recruit somebody or ask another partner within the partnership to sign the lease as you come off.
Okay, that's just Bicken's asked, what's the shortest lease period you can have?
Well, technically, the shortest lease period you can have is 3 years. However, you need to get it approved by the NHS, and they're unlikely to approve that. There has to be extenuating circumstances for them to approve a short lease like that, because it affects the rent and how the property is valued. So yeah, so even if that's the shortest that you can have, it's not necessarily what you'll be approved for.
Okay, here's one from Philip. What are the prospects for notional rent valuations increasing in the next 2 years, given rent in general and property inflation? It's a bit of a hard one for you to
feel like I need a crystal ball. I think notional rents have been on the increase steadily over the last few years. I think they will potentially continue to do that, but how much that increase looks like is very dependent on your building, what's going on in the local area, what's going on within the NHS, what's going on with the banks, in terms of sort of, are they lending? Because the NHS, even though they're not restricted to that, then we'll see whether the GPs are buying into partnerships, and quite a lot of partnerships are already on a sale and leaseback trend. It's becoming more and more common. I speak to ICBs quite regularly. They're seeing it become more of a trend. So yeah, I think notional rents have been steadily increasing, but it's on a very wide amount of variables. And yeah, it doesn't necessarily, because some notional rents are increasing, others will.
Okay, I think that has covered. I think that's covered all the questions we've asked. Apologies if I have missed any. We've obviously had quite a few through, and lots through in different sections. So apologies if I have missed any. If I have, if you could just email us at info@gpsurveyors.co.uk, we'll pick that up and get right back to you. There's just a couple of quick polls, if anyone's still there, just so we can get some feedback really on how you found today's session, how you found kind of signing up and getting the joining instructions and stuff, whether it's worked or there's been any technical difficulties. Just helps us kind of improve, obviously, how we get you guys here and obviously what we deliver. I'm keen to always kind of have feedback from everyone, and if there's any more topics to talk about as such, that's always good to know. Okay, so just a couple more. So that's the sign up one. This is just kind of how today's session's been, whether there's anything we need to improve on, or kind of if you found it useful. Okay, and last but not least, I'll just leave this up here. If there's anything else, any other topics you'd like us to cover in future events, we'd obviously rather hear from the people at attendees as to what these could be, then we can kind of tailor them towards what you guys need, really. That's always very helpful, and I'll just leave up contact details, just so they're just on screen for anyone to jot down that wants to get those. So once again, thanks for attending and thanks for all your questions. It's been a bit of a head scratcher, got us woken up today. Some nice questions in there, I'm sure. Rebecca's we've made Rebecca work, so
Definitely.
got some comments coming through. And yeah, once again, the recording will get sent out to everyone, so if you'd like to pass it to your colleagues, that's obviously perfectly fine. And we'll be in touch with more webinars before the end of the year.